We're going to get started. There is a clinical trial town meeting, clinical trials town meeting at 1 in HSLC, hosted by Dr. Safdar and Dr. Kim. So I don't know if any of you know about that, but that's why we wanted to kind of get a quick head start on this. I promise I'll cover everything. I won't leave until I'm done, but just so that we have an opportunity to get there and hear what they have to say. I'm going to ask folks, I wasn't here the first day that everybody introduced themselves or at least said what they do. So my first question to everybody is, how many of you in this room actually conduct human subjects research? Okay, a couple. And the reason I ask is because I'm never sure with this group how many of you actually conduct the research or how many of you actually support those that conduct the research. But so this presentation I gave last year as well, and it does focus at least a bit on for those who do conduct the research and focuses on the ethics of conducting human subjects research. So hopefully that won't bore you, and you can certainly take that information and understand the complexities that go into conducting human subjects research. So I am Sherry Zeldin. I am the compliance officer for the Department of Medicine, as well as regulatory support for those individuals, PIs, research staff that don't have regulatory staff or support or need more help. I'm always available to help those with that. Okay, so learning objectives for today's course is to gain an understanding and appreciation for the ethical responsibilities of conducting human subjects research, an introduction to what we call good clinical practice, a discussion about what is the protocol, and then, very important, the difference between clinical care and clinical research, and that kind of brings it all together at the end. So ethics in human subjects research. The definition for ethics are moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. And in the context of what we're talking about conducting clinical research with human beings. So a little history, we'll go pretty quickly through this, beginning with the Nuremberg Code, which was set forth in the Nuremberg trials as a result and response to the atrocities of the Nazis. But what was incredibly important about what came out of the Nuremberg trials is they established that voluntary consent of individuals was essential. And we all know that there was no consent in all of the horrific experimentation they did. So that concept of voluntary consent came out of the Nuremberg Code back in 1947. Then with the Declaration of Helsinki in 1975, and I know that a lot of you are much younger than me, but 1975 just doesn't feel that long ago. And when we're talking about ethics and human subjects experimentation. Set of ethical principles developed by the World Medical Association, and what among those concepts that came out in the Declaration of Helsinki is the idea of institutional review boards or independent committees to oversee the ethics of research involving human subjects. So a very big concept, 1975. Then we have the Belmont Report, which was prompted in part by the Tuskegee syphilis study, which expounds on the ethical principles for the protection of human subjects of research. And if there's one thing that sticks with you about this talk, it should be the Belmont Report. It is the three ethical principles of the protection of human subjects of research, and I think that we should all pretty much live by these three standards. And one of them, the first one, is respect for persons. That is obtaining that informed consent, right? No deception. So respect for persons. Beneficence, the concept of doing no harm, maximizing the benefits, minimizing the risks, right? One of the main things that IRBs are responsible for is to evaluate those risks and benefits, or the beneficence. And then justice. Justice in the selection of subjects for your research should be fair. And I was at a lecture once where one of the ethicists kind of summarized the Belmont Report as be nice, be good, and be fair. And I thought that was really excellent. It was an excellent way to remember that those are the three prominent ethical principles of doing human subjects research. 1978 is when the Belmont Report came out.
Tell them what the syphilis study was.
Does everyone know, or did a lot of people know about the Tuskegee syphilis study? Well, someone did ask, and just as a very brief, they recruited African-American men in the South who had syphilis and were told that they would be part of a study to help them with their syphilis. And the fact is, all they did, it was a longitudinal observational study. They never intervene on their health, even when treatment for syphilis became available. So it was horrific and a very ugly scar on this country, one that I think President Clinton apologized for as president. Then comes the Federal Code of Regulations, 1980, which are rules of ethics governing FDA-regulated investigational drug biologic devices. Okay, so some of our rules are overseen by the FDA if we're looking at drugs, biologic devices, investigational. Then we have the Department of Health and Human Services, who came out with the Common Rule in 1981, which is the rule of ethics regarding biomedical and behavioral human subjects research. That is what is the umbrella for all human subjects research that we follow, okay? In addition, there's ICH GCP. How many of you have heard of that? Okay. It is an international guideline for the ethic and scientific quality standards for the design, conduct, every aspect of human subjects research, and ensuring that the rights, integrity, and confidentiality of trial subjects are protected. Covers all aspects of human subjects research. The important thing about ICH GCP is it's above the FDA and the Common Rule, okay? Do we uphold ICH GCP? Absolutely. So there are slight differences in ICH GCP versus FDA, and at this institution we uphold ICH GCP. I'll give you a very quick example of where there's a difference. When we talk about how a subject, after they sign a consent form, needs to get a copy of that consent form, the FDA simply says a copy of that consent form. ICH GCP says a signed copy of that consent form. Do you see the difference there? Very important. And when I was conducting research many years ago, it was incredibly important that they went home, those subjects went home with a signed copy, especially when you're dealing with elderly population, maybe cognitively compromised populations. So they look at this and don't think that somebody might think they never signed the consent form. So very important. Regardless, always keep the original signed consent form. So by following ICH GCP, we are applying the ethical principles to the way we conduct our human subjects research. So how do we apply GCP in the informed consent process? And this is what I'm talking about when I say that this talk is really geared towards those folks who are in the trenches and do this work. So informed consent forms have to have all the required elements and be IRB approved and stamped in order to use it. Everyone know that? Right? Okay. And in order to conduct the informed consent process with the potential subjects, it's imperative that you first know the protocol. I cannot stress that enough. When I used to onboard new research coordinators, the most important thing, besides knowing the protocol, was, of course, reading the informed consent form first, but knowing the protocol so that you are able to discuss the project with the subject. Nothing worse than you having no idea what you are trying to consent them to. It's a disservice to them, and it's a disservice to yourself because it's not right, and it's a disservice to the PI. So know the protocol, okay? So questions can be answered easily and correctly. Make certain to read and thoroughly review the informed consent before presenting it. It's so important. You need to know by reading that informed consent if there are optional specimen collections, or if those specimen collections aren't optional. If the individual has to consent to specimens being collected in order to be in the study. Those are very important things to know. And you need to know that too, because in a consent where we're collecting optional specimens or asking if we can keep the specimens for future research, there's often spaces where they have to check or initial. We need to know that ahead of time, because if something isn't initialed or checked, then you can't keep them, and you have to just assume it was a no, okay? If you are asking someone to participate in a study, it's your obligation to know what the study is and what it entails. You must be informed about that study. Some challenges to informed consent process are legal requirements of the consent form. Can be very scary language. So explaining what some of these things mean is critically important. Complexity of the research, when you have low scientific literacy, it's difficult to put in lay terms. But that is our responsibility. The IRB is looking for that so that we can explain really complex things in more lay terms so that people can not only understand it, but then make an informed choice as to whether to participate or not. Difficulty with comprehension due to an array of issues, and concepts such as placebo, control group, randomization. If you've been in the trenches, you know those things take a little extra time to explain. Okay, not everyone understands what a placebo is, and you can go through an entire consent form and ask the person, so can you tell me, do a little talk back and say, so can you tell me what your understanding of this research is? Yeah, so I get this new medicine, and then, okay, so first thing is not everyone gets that medicine. 50% get it, 50% don't, because there's a placebo. But oftentimes they don't hear that part, or they don't understand that part. So that's why it's really important to help them understand, yes, this is a new drug. We don't know all the risks and benefits, but also you may not get it, okay? Length of the informed consent form can be daunting, and therapeutic misconceptions. Subjects may feel their physician wouldn't suggest it unless it was something that was good for them. Or they may underestimate the risk because their doctor wouldn't suggest it if it was too risky. I don't know if any of you have ever been in that situation, but that can be really compromising. And it's really important, therefore, to make certain they understand, especially when the PI is when the investigator is their clinical physician, that this is not something that they're necessarily endorsing. It is an opportunity or an option that they may participate in. Obtaining consent ethically and effectively, building rapport, obviously, is incredibly important. Asking questions to elicit listening and comprehension. No zoning out, okay? I know that sounds kind of intuitive, but sometimes when you do something over and over again, you're not really paying attention to what you're doing. Obviously, each and every person deserves that attention. After you discuss each part, kind of do that check-in or that talk back. Does that make sense? Does that sound like something you could commit to? Do you have any questions specifically about the drug or the process or the visits? This is intended to be a discussion, not a lecture, okay? Some tips: make sure to approach potential subjects in a private location. I think we all know that, and certainly in the IRB application, we tell them so. Always bring 2 copies of the informed consent form. Why do I say that? Because you don't want to just hand them one and then you don't have one, or you don't want to be going over the pages and them looking over your shoulder or you looking over their shoulder. Okay? You have a copy, they have a copy. Okay? Give them some time to read it. And then come back and say, now I'd like to go through the consent form. If you're still interested. Yes, I'm still interested. Okay, let's go through it. And then talk to them about it. So on page 1, it talks about this. On page 2, if you turn to page 2, right, so it's more of a discussion. And you've got 2 copies. Make certain you have enough time allotted to be able to review the consent. We all have busy, busy days, and we have limited time in the clinics. And we're all rushing to get that consent signed so that we can work them up for eligibility and get them on study. You cannot compromise when it's time to do the informed consent process, okay? There are alternatives to that. You can say, if we don't have the time that we need, are you willing to take it home and read it? And are you willing to have me give you a call and we can discuss it further? There are ways to deal with it, but don't not spend the required time. Don't push. Try not to read directly from the consent form, except when you need to read directly from the consent form, like in the compensation for injury language, which doesn't make sense to anybody, but you read it because it's legalese and it's important. And basically, you read it and you sum it up by saying, participating in this and signing this consent form does not mean you can't sue us if something went wrong. If you don't know the answer, never make it up, right? And I know that sounds intuitive, but sometimes people, how long do those visits usually take? I think probably about half an hour. Don't make it up. Then you go back and find out that's visit 1, that's 2-hour visit. Already you have set up bad feelings with a subject who may come for visit 1 and be really upset, right? That's not a way to start off a good rapport with your participant, particularly when you get into talking about participant retention. Emphasize, when we talk about voluntariness, the voluntary nature, and we know that's one of the required elements of informed consent. When we talk about voluntariness, we have to emphasize at numerous points that the participation is completely voluntary. You can quit at any time if you choose to participate. It's completely fine. It will not affect your care in any way. Sometimes we will say, however, if you do want to quit, please let us know and we may ask you to come back for a final visit just to make sure that everything's okay. Also, if you have any unused medication, if it's an investigational drug, those kinds of things. But they have every right to at any point decide not to participate. Help alleviate feelings of obligation in situations, again, where the potential subject treating physician is also the PI. I was just telling a person the other day I had a treating physician that if he had had a clinical trial, I would have done it for him. It wouldn't have mattered. And so those feelings do happen, right? You really like this physician. They're great physicians, and if he had had a clinical trial that I was eligible for, I would have done it. But you know what? In some ways that's okay because I'm making that decision, right? It's not because I feel that he wasn't pushing me in any way. It was something that I chose to do. Yep, and even if they decide now to participate, they can quit at any time. Okay. Any questions so far? Any questions about any of the informed consent process that I've talked about so far? Anybody disagree? Anybody have any little tidbit they want to share? No? Okay. So how to discuss study procedures? Again, don't make stuff up. You have to tell them how often they're going to come in and how long they're going to be there. Okay? Give them your best estimate of how long you're going to be there. What's going to happen at each visit? Be truthful, okay? And talk about expectations of them. So what we're going to ask you every time you come in, we're going to ask you to bring that diary. Is that something you think you can do? And study diaries become incredibly important in a lot of these trials. And a lot of times subjects don't bring them in, and that's non-compliance because we don't have that data. So it's really important when you're talking about study procedures and you're talking about their willingness to be in a study, you also talk about their responsibilities in a very nice way. But if you think you want to participate in this, this is something we would ask of you. Does this sound like something you'd be able to do? Would you be able to keep a diary every day of when you take your meds? Okay. Or every time you poo, in the case of Kendra. Nothing should come as a surprise to them. Nothing should come as a surprise like one of the visits is a biopsy only. They come in, they register with us, and it's a biopsy only. That should never come as a surprise to them, especially for those who travel, okay? If that is an optional visit, you make sure they know that that is an optional visit and let them decide if they want to do that. And if it's not an optional visit, you let them know that's not an optional visit, and then they can decide if they can do that or not. Study risks. How do we discuss it? Don't sugarcoat or underestimate the risks. The risks are in the consent form. They're there because the IRB requires them. These are the known risks. You discuss them. You can talk about them, or they can be listed in terms of percentage that they occur or known to occur, or you can talk about them in terms of common or rare. You can discuss, because these risks are known, there are contingencies in the protocol for how to handle them if a subject experiences them. And that can be comforting to know, okay? But again, there are unknown risks in a lot of these investigational drug trials, and we have to talk about that as well. We don't know what they are, but there could be. Of course, we would hope that by participating in this clinical trial, it helps give extra eyes on your health and your status so that we can address anything that comes up. Okay. Study benefits. There is no direct benefit for you to participate, period. Right? We can't say there's a benefit. We can say there could be a future benefit to patients with the disease you have, to science, but there is no direct benefit, okay? We cannot state it if we don't know it. And that is why we're doing the research, and that is what you can say. We don't know if there's a benefit. We believe there might be a benefit, but that's why we're doing the research. Possible benefits that you can discuss if IRB approved, and if applicable, is the medication is at no cost. And that can be an incentive. That can be a potential benefit to an individual, okay? One thing you cannot talk about in terms of study benefit is any kind of compensation that you provide for study participation. Money that they may get per visit, travel costs, anything like that. That is not a benefit. Never, ever discuss that as a benefit. That's in the consent form separately under compensation. Okay. In terms of confidentiality, it's important to explain how their confidentiality will be protected. This is huge. Okay, in the days of Henrietta Lacks and HIPAA, we have to talk about how we are going to protect individuals' health information, right? So we can talk about how we assign you a number, and that's what we use to identify you. We won't provide this and that. Your identifiable information is maintained on a secure server somewhere else, and then we have to do that. So we have to talk the talk and do the walk. We don't say to the IRB and to the subjects, we're going to keep everything separate and all your identifiable stuff is separate. We do it, okay? And then when you get audited and the auditors see that it is kept separate, then you are in good shape. If they see that it is not separate, then you're in trouble, okay? Because this is something that we say we're doing. And this, by saying we're doing it, helps us get approved by the IRB. Obviously, we always have to disclose there's a slight breach of confidentiality, a slight chance of a breach of confidentiality, and we also must disclose who and what agencies or organizations can potentially see our private health information. So the goal of clinical research is to ensure the right safety and welfare of research participants above and beyond all things, and also to ensure the quality and integrity of the data collected, avoid deviation and noncompliance along the way, because when we have bad data, it affects the integrity of the study, right? If we don't have good data, then we don't have anything. So the means by which to achieve these goals is to follow the protocol. And that's what we're going to talk about next. The protocol is the study plan for which the research is based on. The study must be conducted to ensure ethical conduction, patient safety, and data integrity by following that protocol where all aspects of study conduction are laid out. It is also the way you told the IRB that you would be conducting the study, and that's what they approved. So if you start doing things in a way different than what you told the IRB, then that's where problems arise. And that's also why the IRB, as many of you know, look at your protocol and often will make recommendations for your protocol. Sometimes we don't take them, sometimes we do. So the protocol is designed to safeguard the health of the subjects while aiming to answer specific research question. It includes specific information how to carry out the protocol, including who can participate, schedule of tests, procedures, treatment, lengths of study, depending on what the study is, right? It allows researchers at multiple locations, if it is a multi-site trial, to perform the study in exactly the same way so that their data can be combined. If we had, and after Nichelle's talk last week about the single IRB, it makes so much sense to have a single IRB reviewing the same protocol, because then one IRB has made changes or revisions and they're not all different. Everyone is conducting that study the same way, conducting the same data points, doing everything the same way. Same informed consent except for institutional language. So these are all kinds of different elements of a protocol. One of the things in the inclusion and exclusion section of a protocol is it is critical to consider what you put in the inclusion and exclusion section for a given study to ensure patient safety. And I say this too to a lot of our new investigators. It impacts you greatly what you put in the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And if you would like to be able to recruit subjects and not have to change your protocol 80 million times, be really thoughtful about what those criteria are, okay? Each criteria should have a specific rationale for its inclusion or exclusion. Why? Why did the investigator choose that specific age range or test result range? Is it purposeful or is it arbitrary? And did they think about it? When designing a study, all contraindicated medical conditions, con meds, age, all those things must be considered, knowing the potential risks of the drug or device or biologic. If we understand the rationale, we're more likely to comply with the parameters of the protocol. And I put here I did some protocol clinical research training with some chemo nurses years ago when I worked at the cancer center. And what would happen is investigators would have, and still do, these clinical research protocols, very complex, cancer-related protocols with experimental agents. And there were study coordinators and research nurses, but who gave the study drug? It was the chemo nurses in the chemo clinic. It wasn't the research nurses, it wasn't the study coordinators, it was the chemo nurses. So there was this disconnect right away, right? And then we asked the chemo nurses, oh, by the way, when a patient comes in with this, you have to collect these PKs. You have to collect blood pressure every 10 minutes. You have to collect this and this and this and this. And the chemo nurses were like, I hate clinical research. I don't want to participate in clinical research. So there was a lot of non-compliance. They didn't have the time, nor they didn't want to do it. Why do they want to do it? Because no one ever talked to them about protocols, what the idea behind these protocols were, what their part in the protocol was. And once that was done, they were like, oh, I get it. There's a reason for this. There's a reason why I have to collect that blood pressure every 10 minutes. I get it now. And it really created buy-in from these chemo nurses. Why in the world would we not include them when we're talking about conducting this trial? Why would we not include them in the discussion? And also get their input in how we can make this more manageable. So, if there is a change, we have to amend the protocol, right? Do not act on a change until it's IRB approved, right? Unless, of course, it's for the safety of the patients. And not only do we have to amend the protocol, but we have to consider, do we have to amend the informed consent form? Is it a change that impacts the informed consent form? That's always a huge consideration. And if so, make those changes and submit that as well to the IRB. So before a protocol can be conducted, it must be reviewed and approved by a scientific review committee or peer reviewed to ensure it's scientifically sound, okay? It must then be reviewed and approved by an IRB to ensure that it's ethically sound. Considerations for eligibility determinations. This is a question to you. Can you perform a study test to see if a potential subject is eligible before they sign consent form? Anybody?
If you have IRB approval for it.
Nope. The answer is absolutely no. You can look up, you can do some preparatory to research, right? And you can look up existing levels, you can look up existing disease state, you can look anything up. Any kind of study test that is specific for the study, you cannot until they sign consent.
How about for eligibility though?
Nope.
I feel like we've done this, and maybe it changed, because you can request a waiver for informed consent to determine study eligibility under certain circumstances.
Not a study-specific test. What are you referring to? The stool sample?
Yes, that's
So
what I'm
if it's
thinking of as
considered
well.
like minimally risk, I mean,
Minimum.
everybody knows the bathroom, for example, so we have for one of our studies that we ask people for a stool sample prior to doing the full informed consent process to see if they have particular bacteria in the stool setting.
However, you have talked to the individual, right? And they're interested in participating, right? So this is, I see Jim Jones has metastatic thyroid cancer, and I'd like to see if possibly he's eligible for this. So when Jim Jones comes in for his clinic visit, we add another test specific for the study to see if he's eligible. That is a no-no. And except for that stool situation, it really is absolutely not okay to do any kind of study specific. And the IRB asks us, The IRB in the application, one of the questions is, will you be performing any specific tests prior to the consent? And the answer is no, unless apparently you can collect their poo. But
And that's specifically approved under an IRB waiver.
it,
But for example,
true.
a blood draw would be considered too risky, because you can, pass out, get a bruise, so like that wouldn't be acceptable.
Right. Additionally, you cannot make the eligible patient for the study. The reason I say that is if their labs come back and they're not eligible for the study, they're not eligible. You can't then try to make them eligible by giving them water or giving them fluids and trying to affect their labs. They could come back at a later date, maybe, and you can do the test result again at a later date, but you can't make patients eligible. And this comes from many, many years of being in the trenches and PIs desperately wanting to accrue patients and doing those kinds of things, manipulating results. And you can't do that, okay?
Or changing inclusion/exclusion criteria to make it work.
Without getting IRB approval. Absolutely.
Just changing the criteria willy-nilly just because
Right.
people are following.
Exactly. And that's the important point is sometimes when I meet with new investigators, I feel like some of the inclusion/exclusion criteria are willy-nilly. So really think about if these are going to stick and if these are important, because there may come a time when you have a subject but they don't meet this and you wish you wouldn't have put it in because they'd be a perfect subject for it. So they have to make sense. They have to make sense.
Excuse me. Would it be unethical for a researcher if you saw that type of patient and you decide to go and take your consent form back to IRB for adjustment or whatever?
You can do that. You can do that. Take the consent form back to the IRB. You can't accrue that patient until that's been changed. Does that make sense, Isaac? Yeah. You can change anything you want in your protocol and your ICF, but you can't accrue a subject based on those changes until they're approved. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, this is me. You can listen or you don't have to. But in my world, the PI needs to sign and date an eligibility checklist prior to a subject being registered to the study. And why is that? To ensure that the PI has confirmed that the subject is eligible. Because the PI is ultimately responsible for the conduct of that study, right? So you have an eligibility checklist. It may be as simple as the inclusion and exclusion on a piece of paper. And you go through each one of those and you ensure that that subject meets those criteria. You have the PI review that and sign and date it before the patient is enrolled in the study. And you now are compliant with GCP because the PI is ultimately responsible for that decision to put a subject on the trial. Okay. Anybody have any question about that?
I'm only thinking of logistics.
I'm sorry?
I'm thinking of logistics.
Uh-huh. Oh, absolutely.
What if you have a potential subject,
Mm-hmm.
and if you are able to, if the subject consent that day, the first test of visit is supposed to take place, and the PI is not around.
Oh, you can. Okay, so let me just make sure I'm speaking clearly. Is you can work them up for eligibility. You can do the test. You can work them up for eligibility. What you should not do is put them on trial, put them on study. Okay, randomize them, treat them before the PI has a chance to look at that eligibility criteria. Now you have all of them there and it looks like this subject is eligible, but you're not the PI, right? We're not even physicians, right? We can't make that determination and it's the PI's responsibility. If you're doing an industry-sponsored trial, before you go and randomize that subject, you should have a PI signature on an eligibility checklist saying, yes, I agree this patient is eligible. Protocol adherence to treatment. You folks can look at this. I want to just make sure that we're on time. Treatment and intervention must be administered strictly following the parameters laid out in the protocol. It should be very clear in a research chart, whether that's electronic or on paper or whatever, what group that individual was assigned to if it's a randomized study. Are they in group A? Are they in group B? Are they in group C? What group are they in? You need to know that. The study parameter, study schedule section of the protocol must be strictly adhered to. We all know what I'm talking about, the graph with visit 1 and all this happens, right? It needs to be specifically adhered to. And lab results, and again, this is from my oncology background, lab test results must be resulted out and reviewed prior to treatment of the study drug. Why do I say that? Because they may not meet treatment parameters. They may have to have that drug reduced, or they may not be able to be given that drug that day. So it's critical, okay, that if you're doing an intervention drug trial and you are doing safety labs, that you wait for those safety labs to be resulted out before you treat the subject that day, so you know how to proceed. Okay. So there should be no room for subjective interpretation of the protocol. If something is not clear, ask the PI for clarification. If something in the protocol is not the intention of the PI, like we've been talking about, then the protocol needs to be amended and IRB approved before implementing the change. In my world, no protocol exceptions or eligibility waivers should be requested nor allowed, okay? And it's what the IRB approved is being conducted ethically and safely, so make sure you follow it. We never want to see this at a PI meeting when asked, how many of you do not follow the protocol, right? Once a patient becomes a subject or a participant and is put on study, it is at that point that the study parameters must be followed as outlined in the protocol. The treatment must follow the treatment section of the protocol, and the PI no longer has the flexibility of what he or she would do in the clinical practice setting. Does everyone agree with that? So we're going to end this talk trying to get a true understanding of what we mean between clinical practice and clinical research. So a clinical practitioner can treat individual patients using standard treatments that in his or her opinion are best for the patient. If that practitioner is an investigator in a clinical research study, that same clinician is now obligated to follow the study protocol that describes exactly how assessments and interventions must be carried out to ensure subject safety and data integrity. And remember, it's not always their protocol they're conducting. It can be an industry-sponsored protocol. It can be an NIH-sponsored protocol, right? So let's take the HAT test. The case scenario is patient presents in clinic with a platelet count of 75,000. If they're wearing their clinical practitioner hat, CP, the clinician can use his or her own discretion, right, to decide whether to treat the patient with this platelet count, and most likely they probably would. But what happens when they put on their clinical research hat that looks a whole lot like their clinical practice hat? The investigator must now consult the protocol, and the protocol states that the patient cannot be treated unless the platelet count is above or equal to 100,000. So what do we do in this situation? The investigator can't treat that patient, can they? The trick is to remember which hat they're wearing. And the only thing to come between these two hats is this, my little hat trick. It's famous. Okay. An example of how these lines can get blurry. We've got Dr. X, who's a clinician, and he treats patient 1 and he treats patient 2. And he treats them both according to standard of care, no problem. But what happens when Dr. X, who's also a clinical research investigator, now enrolls patient 1 on their clinical trial? Dr. X is not the clinician anymore. He's the clinical research investigator who can no longer have the flexibility in patient 1's treatment. So patient 1 is now on a clinical trial. He can no longer treat patient 1 as if he was a patient. Does that make sense? It can get really blurry. The difference is to remember what hat they're wearing. The regulations governing the conduction of clinical research outline potential consequences of not upholding their commitment as investigator. And it's nothing to joke about. I mean, there are serious consequences of a PI not upholding their responsibility. This is human subjects research. They can get FDA 483, where the FDA comes out and audits, and they have to complete, they have a bunch of deficiencies, and they have to do a CAPA and show how they're going to rectify their misbehavior. They can get a warning letter, which is significant regulatory violations that can lead to enforcement, which includes disqualification as a clinical investigator, restrictions, debarment, and criminal prosecution. There are investigators who have gone to jail because they misbehaved. That's a really bad slide. Top 5 common mistakes. Number 5, insufficient investigator involvement. Number 4 is inadequate supervision and training of study staff. I don't know if you've ever been involved in a researcher's lab or whatever where people weren't trained well. People aren't doing what they need to be doing, and there needs to be better oversight. Inappropriate delegation of study staff and overcommitted investigators. But the number one reason, which has been up on the slide the whole time by mistake, is failure to follow the protocol. And I joke, but even when it's their own protocol, they fail to follow it. They wrote it. They have to follow the protocol. Protocols are written to ensure the safety of the patients, right? Minimize the risks, maximize the benefits. Oh, there. Never mind. A television show we never want to see. Orange is the new white. And there's Dr. Dreamy. Yeah. So that is it. That is what I came to talk to you about. Any questions, any comments?
What do we traditionally do for PIs who do want to enroll their own patients in studies? Because I thought that was kind of a shady area to begin with, where you have to have somebody else ask them for you or something.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, there's nothing ethically prohibiting them from recruiting their own patients. What I find most beneficial is to have somebody else introduce the study. If the PI wants to do their own informed consent, you really can't argue. And then some industry-sponsored trials will require that the PI consent their patients. But to maximize that the benefit and minimize any kind of coercion is have a study coordinator or a sub-I or somebody else introduce the study to the participant, and then find out, is that something that you may be interested in? Dr. X is actually here and would be very willing to talk to you about it if you're interested. So help introduce it. The other thing, and we used to do this years ago when I did osteoporosis research, is the study coordinators would consent the subjects, and then the PI would come in after and do the kind of the talk through with the subject. So, you know, what did Sherry tell you the study's about? What's your understanding? And it was great because it was the PI. He had a great understanding of the study. He could talk at a higher level about the study than I could. And he cared. He cared whether people really understood what they were getting involved in. He also understood the importance of subject adherence and retention. So that's the perfect way, is to have somebody else consent them and then have the PI come in afterwards, kind of get a feeling for if they understand it, how well they understand it, and then, yeah. Anybody else?
So for like an observational study, so you're not actually providing a treatment or intervention or anything, and an individual is eligible for everything but ineligible for like one of the tests or things that you do, but that you don't state that test as being optional per se. Again, it's observational though. Is that okay to enroll that person?
So just explain a little more. So you're saying
So you're just doing
because of a test, they're not eligible.
Right,
What
so
kind of
specific
test?
procedure. So we do like MRIs, lumbar punctures, exercise testing, blood draws. And so someone can be ineligible for say an MRI but could do everything else.
Ineligible for an MRI because they're not able to get an MRI?
Correct.
Okay.
They have metal in their body or something, so they can't, for safety reasons, do the MRI, but they can do everything else. Is that okay to enroll them or not?
Yes, if that's what the protocol says,
So if you don't say anything is optional,
then it's required. So that's an interesting point, is what is the point of the MRI? Is that data that you're going to be looking at? Is there a baseline? Are they going to look at a future MRI? And is that an important data point? And that may be a really important data point. So if somebody can't have an MRI, then it wouldn't behoove the investigator to accrue them. However, it may just be an additional data point that if you're missing that MRI test, it still may be valuable data to get. But you'd have to state that in the protocol. Yep. Anything else? I really appreciate your attention.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thanks.